The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or to view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
What are the biggest problems that the world faces, and what should we be doing to solve them? And it started with some conversation about global warming and climate change, or whatever you want to call it. And this friend of mine likes to organize meetings, and he said, well, that looks like a real disaster in the next 50 years, and maybe the ocean will rise 2 or 5 meters, and that will remove the habitat of 20% of all the people in the world, and they'll all move somewhere else, and the places that they move will already be full of people, because we're talking about 2050 or 60, and there will be various arguments about the few resources left on the planet. So we were talking about that a little bit, and then the question came up, well, maybe that's just one of a dozen other disasters. And so I started cataloging possible disasters. And anyway, this philanthropist said, well, let's have a conference to discuss that, and see if we can find some serious problem that nobody has noticed, and so on and so forth. So what do you think? Now, during the period when AI looked like it was progressing rapidly, lots of people got panicked and went into science fiction mode and said, well, what if in fact, 2 novels I found very impressive. One was Colossus by an English writer named D.F. Jones. Any of you read that? It became a movie called The Forbin Project. The movie wasn't terribly good, but the thesis was that if you started fooling around with AI and you got really fast supercomputers, then maybe the thing would start evolving, because if you can't solve a problem, what do? You try a lot of things, and then you see which of them seem to be leading to some improvement, and then you collect the programs that seem to make a little progress and mix their parts and recombine them. And in fact, maybe half a dozen projects in the last 50 years have been people who said, instead of trying to program an intelligent machine, why don't we just evolve one by generating lots of random code and giving it problems and selecting the ones that work and taking pieces of their DNA and recombining them. And there's about a dozen such programs, and I don't think I could remember them all. Larry Fogel had one, so if you look up, I think it's Fogel. And to make a short story even shorter, all of them showed signs of progress and then flattened out. The most impressive one was I think I mentioned them briefly, by Douglas Lennart. And he had the one that he set toward discovering mathematics, and it was a set of list programs. So there's a list function, which was the length of a list, which means that Lisp can represent numbers a little bit, and this program called Automated Mathematician computed various functions of sets, and it would make new sets, and that's the one that discovered prime numbers, except that it concluded that 9 was a prime for some reason. But that didn't bother it much, because then it invented all sorts of other elementary mathematical processes, and of course every now and then it would get something wrong, but who cares? If it got a lot of them right, it would reward it, and so on. Anyway, it flattened out. I think I told this story the other day. Later he won this contest of simulated naval engagements, which the Naval War College had an annual contest. How do you program a fleet to defeat another fleet? And Lynette's fleet, yeah, I did tell that. A fleet can only go as fast as its slowest ship. So Lynette's fleet, unlike all the others, turned its guns backwards and sunk its slowest ship repeatedly. And this enabled it to win all the battles, because the other people who had been to Naval War College spent a lot of time writing programs that would defend their weakest ship. I'm not sure what the moral of that is. If you're fighting a war, you have to change your ordinary value system. Anyway, of course, at the same time, there were lots of people who took these scenarios seriously and said, the AI, and this whole group of them today, they say they're doing research on how to make friendly AIs. And I regard this as exceedingly comical, because they don't know how to make anything as smart as a 18-month-old child or your favorite dog. And however, the scenario in the Colossus novel is that, yes, progress is slow for a while, but then suddenly it goes from being good at something to getting control of all the other computers in the world in the next 15 minutes, including another one in Russia, which by some remarkable coincidence has also become smart around the same time. And then Colossus, which is the name of D.F. Jones' computer. Forbin is the programmer who started the project. The movie didn't use the word Colossus because it's probably not in the average person's vocabulary. Anyway, Colossus suddenly decides that it's not smart enough. And so it orders, Jones is an Englishman, it orders the English government to clear off one of the Channel Islands, and it's going to build a bigger copy of itself. That'll be smarter. And Forbin asks why, and Colossus says, because I've been analyzing signals from extraterrestrial sources, and there's a really smart machine coming here, and it's going to kill all of us, and so I have to build a machine that's 1 million times smarter than I am, so that we'll be able to, and so on. So there's a typical scenario, and the friendly AI people say, how can we make sure that one of the AI projects won't suddenly take over the world and have some paranoid fantasy about why it has to kill all the people to make it safe for the next generation of beings. Or science fiction writers are good at thinking. So I'm asking you to think of other disasters. What's the worst disaster you can think of? Oh, well, we're next to worst. Don't.
I had one. I don't know if it's the worst case. There's actually a movie that's somewhat representative of this case. Have you seen the movie Idiocracy?
Yes.
Yeah, with the society and like.
That's what happens afterwards.
Completely idiotic. Yeah, so it sort of makes me wonder if you see this to some extent now where people have systems that augment some of the things they used to do so much that they stop paying attention to or stop learning some of the stuff they used to. And
I
that's,
can't remember how it began, but you end up with a world where they're starving and somebody says, well, I think there's something called seeds, and if you plant them, you...
exactly. They're watering their plants with Gatorade in one part because it has electrolytes. So, but maybe one problem is that you might start to see a big divide between people who increasingly rely on technology to be able to learn nothing, and people who take advantage of technology to learn a lot. So maybe there'll be this sort of divide in the future, people who know a lot and are very smart and intelligent, people who just don't or don't have motivation to. And then the problem becomes, like, who takes care of who and how does that work? And do you try and get people to be more motivated or?
Well, there is this weird phenomenon that could happen again, which is a nice question of why did science stop with Archimedes and not pick up again till Galileo? So there's, anybody have a theory? Why did progress stop? And one popular theory is that the rise of religions. But of course, as far as we know, there were always religions. How come Christianity and Islam had such a powerful effect for so much of the world for how long? And is there a chance somebody could just invent another one tomorrow that would spread through and wipe out everything? And how do you detect it and stop it before it starts to spread? So that's something that could happen. It's happened before. Or suppose somebody invented a new kind of not quite sound logical argument that convinces everyone, which would be almost the same thing, I suppose. Have we been just lucky that nobody thought of a false argument that you can use to convince anybody of anything?
Well, maybe we have protection mechanisms against something like that happening. And as for the first thing...
You mean it used to happen and a few people evolved a way to reject it. And now it's so common that we don't even know about it. I don't know, can you imagine, what is it like? If something is very convincing, you get this feeling, well, that promises too much, I'll ignore it. That could be. That's why we turn down, when thesis proposals get rejected, sometimes it's because they don't promise enough, but usually it's because they're going to solve everything. And then the thesis advisor says, well, here's this little problem, can you solve that? And the student goes away, and if we're lucky, they come back with something that'll solve that instead of everything.
I think it's all happening again right now. Essentially, when the economy collapses, then people have to worry about other things, so their attention is elsewhere. The Visigoth at the gate are eating. Look at what's happening now with the economies. There are theories that are proven to be pretty bad, and they're bringing everything down. Do you think they'll be followed by more theories or practical action?
Let's see. Is this one worse than the 1929 depression? That got most of the world, didn't it?
It did.
Not yet.
It's not quite there,
But it's much worse.
because Argentina and a few other countries don't seem to have collapsed yet.
Back then we had the gold standard, now we only have the paper money standard. So they're shoring up the walls, but when it falls, it's going to be very bad indeed.
Didn't gold hit $3,000 recently? It was over 2,000. Yeah.
When people start not trusting the currency anymore, like the main currency, because like the currency is just a contract, and so if you don't trust anymore like the people that print the currency, then we can have like this, like countries will not be as organized as before. Because why should I be poor if there is, well,
Well, of course, that's why people are going to gold. I'm not sure they're going to gold for security. I think they're just trying to make more money. But who knows?
but okay.
Well, how do you fix an economic depression? I believe World War II helped.
That may be the solution again. So I guess positing it as a disaster, I would say that the collective archive of human information and knowledge becomes so polluted with bullshit that you can no longer find actual useful fact among the propaganda.
Well, then there are, pretty soon high school students will be able to make new genomes. They can do it. So that's a typical technological disaster that, did you read the paper last week that some lab made the best smallpox virus ever? Yeah.
But you can have agencies that control that. I mean, there are many kind of weapons that you can create at home. The fact that you can create them doesn't mean that people are going to create them. And you just need to
Well, but if you have 7 billion people and you only need one to create the smallpox that kills everybody,
you don't give the resources to...
it doesn't take any. These machines will be $1,000 soon. How much does a sequence? Well, you have to buy the DNA bottles. Might cost several dollars to make the ultimate virus.
Why would people sell these machines like...
They are. They've just gotten cheap enough that you can buy one. We're just on the, they used to cost $1 million. But now there's a place down on, what's the street after Vassar Street? Albany Street. Company there that has sequencers which are only $50,000.
Can't we control like the spread of a disease? Like, for example, the swine flu,
They don't know how to stop AIDS after 30 years of well-funded research.
yeah, but we still have a lot of people. So if like 1 billion people die, it's just 1 billion. I mean, it's
But it
hard.
might, you see, it might kill everybody in a year, and it takes 5 years to make a new drug. So it's a sort of, I don't think there's an answer to that one right now, except that right now you get a prize if you synthesize something. Tom Knight had, oh, he had some high school students make interesting things. But there are lots of projects like that now, where people in biology courses can design something and get it onto a gene-making machine. So that's a serious problem. Yeah.
So we have like these big problems, and we have other several ones. Like we are not very smart as individuals, and also we can't communicate very well, like very fast. And probably we need machines that can solve these problems for us. Do you believe that Brooks' approach of like solving, creating robots, like intelligent robots, is good? And how is it compared to Winston's approach? Like he's doing more research and trying to create something, I believe, more similar to a human being than like a human intelligent.
Well, he's trying to make a machine that can do common sense reasoning, what we call common sense reasoning.
Yeah, but do you think that's that's better because we will solve problems like the problem of like having people that produce viruses very cheap? And then like these robots can solve these problems for us probably if they're smarter than us, if they have enough processors. Or do you think that's better than creating, like, for example, Brooks is creating robots that solve other problems?
Well, that's a question of whether can you make a machine that's very good at some, I mean, there are things like mathematical problems, like factoring numbers, and you could make a supercomputer. Nobody has, but you could imagine working on that problem and eventually finding some way to make a computer factor very large numbers quickly. Now, nobody has proved that that's a NP problem as far as it. Does anybody know? Is factoring an NP hard problem?
It has not been shown to be NP hard.
What?
It has not been shown to be NP hard.
Recently, there's a 2002 paper that proved that factoring, that showed a polynomial algorithm for factoring. Like recently, in 2000.
It's been shown to be polynomial?
Yeah.
That's nice. Or not. I don't know. I haven't kept track.
Oh, no, that's if something's
Oh yeah, yeah,
That's yeah. I think right now is they don't think it's NP hard, but if it turns out to be polynomial with like the entire hierarchy kind of collapses, I think that's what happens. But yeah, it's weird.
There are known to be problems that are not polynomial, but what's the standard NP problem, Mike? Which one?
that.
Boolean satisfiability.
Friedberg and Muchnik had a complicated process between where two Turing machines are passing data to each other, and that was not, they proved that that was NP, but simpler than the standard one. So there are things on the hierarchy that are lower than the combinatorial standard ones. But anyway, but the question is, can you make a machine that can understand Shakespeare plays, but that leaves no possibility that 10 minutes later it can do unthinkably dangerous things? And I think the answer is no. Nobody. It's hard to see any difference between literary thinking and scientific thinking. I mean, a novel is like a very long proof of something with a few bugs. I don't see general literature as any different from technical literature, except the criterion for success is much lower. I made a whole list of things, but I don't know if that thing works. wake up. Well, my screen is blue. It may actually... Is it actually working? Oh, I could... Is there any point in my turning on the control panel?
It's set for multiple displays. I think it's not showing over here.
Oh, well, maybe the connector's loose or something. Oh, well. It doesn't have any diagrams. I mean, we already have problems that look pretty serious, like when people started worrying about population a generation ago, it was carefully explained that as soon as people achieved a substantial income, then the number of children per family would disappear. And I don't know if that rumor is still... How many of you believe that as the standard of living goes up, the population declines? Seems to be true in some countries, but it only takes one exception. Yeah.
I always thought it was more correlated to education about methods of preventing.
Well, if you don't get married till you get your PhD,
Oh, right.
and if we manage to make the PhD take 15 years, has anybody proposed that? That would...
And I feel like part of it with developing countries where standards of living are low, one of the reasons why population is so high is that they don't really have good methods of birth control, right? It's not necessarily that
Yes.
they want to be having so many kids, but it's just that they have fewer methods of preventing it.
There's also, if you have 7 kids and 4 of them die, then you say, oh, what am I going to do when I retire? And so you quickly have 4 more if you can. So.
Right, so I guess they are accounting for the fact that a lot of kids are likely to die in childhood.
Anyway, but once you have robots, then we won't need kids anymore.
Like in Japan?
What's happening in Japan? The birth rate is way down.
Well, I think in Japan they have a problem with an aging population and not enough young people to take care of them. So I think they're investing a lot in humanoid robots or robots that can take care of old people.
Yes, I see the Honda robot has gotten a little smaller and doesn't fall over quite so quickly.
Have you seen it dance? It's pretty cute.
There's something wrong with its posture, though, because apparently it doesn't know, it can't straighten its legs without falling over, so it's always, it's walking. Anybody know why? Maybe it doesn't have any spinal joints. Anyway, cars can't walk yet. So what other disasters do we?
Well, there's always global warming.
That looks hard to fix.
Yeah, doesn't look like people want to fix.
I have a friend named Russell Seitz who appears to have a good solution to it, which is terribly simple and it turns out that if you have an ocean and you make little bubbles by you have a tube running in back of a ship, and it has little holes. And if you make micron-sized bubbles, then they turn the water white, because the interface between water and air is a change of refractive index, and that reflects a lot of light. And it turns out that if you do that in distilled water, the bubbles go away pretty quickly, because the smaller a bubble is, the higher the pressure inside. Everybody know why? Because surface tension is constant on the boundary, so the pressure is proportional to the curvature. Because the smaller the bubble is, the greater the force per square inch of surface. Pull it in. But in seawater, there's enough oils and other things in any cubic centimeter seawater to coat a micron-sized bubble with a sort of oily film, or one that doesn't let the air out of the bubble. So the bubble is good for several hours, and the bubble tends to float up to the top, stay in the top few inches of water, and if there's a wave, it goes down, but it comes up again. So his calculations show that if you have a few thousand ships, which at any time crossing the Atlantic, for example, there are a few thousand ships, and each of them is producing a half-mile wide streak of whiteness that lasts a few hours, then you can change the reflectivity of that part of the Earth by 2 or 3% at very low energy cost. And the nice thing is, if it doesn't work, you turn it off. Some of the plans are to put sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere, and if it doesn't work, you can't do anything for a few years. So there's a fairly expensive, but not seriously expensive, possible solution. And it took him 3 or 4 years to convince anybody of it, and now the idea might be catching on. But every now and then somebody invents something that actually works, and that's a possibility. Maybe you can invent something. Painting roofs white also works, but there aren't enough of them. And you might have to clean them every now and then.
Maybe it's time to reconsider laser-powered volcano lancing amid huge amounts of particulate matter into the atmosphere by controlled volcanic emission.
Yes, was it 1883?
Pimentel or Krakatoa?
Krakatoa. There was the year without a summer all over the world from one gigantic explosion.
So it happened again this year thanks to Greenland.
What's that?
They're about to have a major eruption in Greenland.
Oh, do you think it'll help, or is it just going to warm the water up a little?
No, they estimate this one may shut down air traffic over Europe for 2 years.
Well, people shouldn't travel anyway. Why don't they just use the internet and Twitter?
Well, if they jet everywhere, the jet contrails are not too much different from the boat bubbles.
It would take a lot of airplanes, but yes. Nobody knows if these bubbles would have a bad effect, but it's hard to. But the nice thing is you could turn them off in a few hours. He's gotten some attention from people who want to conserve water in the Colorado Basin and places. For better or for worse, there's nobody in charge of the earth. So nobody wants to spend any money on that unless they can get their money back. I have lots of disasters, but I want a new one.
So do you believe in global warming? Oh well, that is happening now. The Chinese say it's global cooling until 2068.
Well, somebody might be right, but as far as I know, all the big simulations claim to get a few degrees a degree per decade or something, don't they?
The Western models tend to underestimate the role of the sun in it. So things like the Maunder minimum, if it's in fact coming.
That was 300 years or something?
Yes.
Well, if you knew how to turn that on, that would help.
Well, we seem to be going into a solar minimum now where there's low flux and sunspots, but no...
There are no sunspots this year. Nobody knows why. Or, well, a few people know why, but nobody knows which ones they are.
Well, it's the end of the Maya calendar, so
Of which?
the Maya calendar.
Calendar, they didn't have
Was
a...
it next year?
2020.
Oh, yeah.
It's like December.
Oh, next year. So,
Is there just one copy? I think I've seen it somewhere. It's in Yucatan when I was a kid. And they explained that oh, never mind, human sacrifice place. But it worked. Everybody makes fun of human sacrifice, but here we are. And is it going up?
It's on strike.
yeah.
Doesn't matter. I'm just looking at my notes.
So is there anything on your list that could be cured by making smarter people?
What if they didn't agree? If people were really smart, then they would agree. Is that possible?
I don't know.
I don't know what it means.
I don't either.
Well, that's a serious question. I mean, what do you think people should work on if you were going to do a PhD thesis on AI? What would you aim toward? And recently we had a student who had decided for some reason to imagine a commonsensical kitchen project. So the idea was that, as you know, various projects, including at MIT, are collecting common sense knowledge about the world and trying to make programs and do reasoning about it. Henry Lieberman's project here is the most famous one is the Psych project that I mentioned before. It's the same Lennart fellow. After he wrote these early AI programs that solved mathematical problems and simulated evolution and little things like that, then he decided that you couldn't really have a smart machine unless it knew a lot, because it might take 1,000 years to accumulate knowledge just by doing experiments. So I think Leonard was the first one to start accumulating a large common sense knowledge base, and I imagine that that current project may still be the largest one. I don't know. Psych is short for encyclopedia or something. And so we did have a student who said, well, here's a nice quiet world, the kitchen world, and you want to make something that has certain properties, so you have to figure out what ingredients and how long to cook them, or you have a knowledge base with recipes, and then if somebody wants something new, you... So that's a typical project, and several of us talked that student out of it, or managed to, and because we didn't see any chance of the Colossus disaster coming. It's almost the opposite. I keep getting messages from the Friendly AI Society, and that there exists a bunch of apparently smart people who are saying, how can we do AI research without the risk of making a machine that suddenly becomes very smart and takes over the world and kills everybody? And they write all these papers about ways to make friendly AI, and they have discussion groups where somebody proposes such a thing and somebody else points out 5 obvious bugs in that, and these people are pretty serious. Just look up friendly AI on your browser. Yes?
Professor, do you think that sort of Terminator, Hollywood movie scenario is a legitimate concern?
Yes. I think there are a lot of... I think the smallpox, the 100% lethal smallpox is what this one was advertised as. How many of you saw the press release on that? 3 or 4. It killed all the mice. I think it was 12 mice, but there might have been something else in their food, who knows. Yes, I think it's a serious problem, and it would be great if somebody in that group actually got a good idea about how to detect these troubles before they spread. I just don't recommend any of you work on it for your thesis or something, because I don't think there's a good answer. See, if it gets smarter than all the people put together in 5 minutes, then nothing we've thought of could stop it. But
I mean something different from like a smallpox virus, so like a self-governing sort of entity.
it's very hard to... Well, in the Colossus novel, which is quite well worked out, the machine says, this creature from outer space is coming, and from its behavior, you can see that it's a really super intelligent thing. It's really dangerous, and so I have to get the people to support me to figure out some way. I mean, how do you stop a thing that's coming at almost the speed of light and blah, blah, blah? Maybe the only solution is to change physics. So you have to think of some once you understand physics very well, maybe you can turn a switch and change the gravitational constant and so forth. And if you start fooling around with that, then there's probably only one chance in 10 to the 10th you can do that without turning the universe into a black hole. So all of these large-scale adventures are very risky. So are you afraid to make an AI if you could?
It seems like a self-replicating thing may be just as dangerous as the meanest of AI.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
It just replicates itself massively.
Michael Crichton had a nice novel. I forget how he... What happened? Did anybody read his nanotech novel? Gray. What was it called?
Prey. P-R.
Yes, right. What was the solution, or was there one?
I don't remember. It's been a while since I've read it.
I don't remember. Not sure I got to the end. Yes.
I suspect that AIs, if it's able within 5 minutes to make itself that much smarter, is going to outstrip self-replicating machines, because self-replicating machines have to constantly requisition resources for themselves, and each of them are only as intelligent, basically, as the cells on the edges, whereas the centralized AI has got a lot of computing power to think.
Yeah, well, if it wants 10 to the 30th bits of memory, it'll probably have to make a self-replicating memory system, but it would surely be smart enough not to make one that will wipe itself out. Because
Apparently, the solution in Prey was very similar to War of the Worlds. They defeated it with a virus.
oh,
What?
Yes. It's a phage.
did they make their own, or did it just evolve?
They made their own. High school students.
Because in the H.G. Wells one, the virus just happened to be there, and the people didn't make it. But H.G. Wells must have written that around 1910 or something like that.
I do like the idea that various end-of-world scenarios cancel each other out.
Well, the news about that smallpox virus was pretty scary. I wonder if it's been published. Is the smallpox virus sequence in public property now? Because you could make one in your backyard cellar.
So you're saying that bad homework by high school students could be a catastrophe?
Wait a minute, I think it was a flu virus, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's what I heard.
Sorry, not smallpox. Smallpox was pretty bad. And we're still getting vaccinated for it, aren't we? What was... I forgot the question. Never get an idea while you're listening to someone else. Yes.
So, one of the problems is aging, and there are people working on that. But I think in parallel, there are people struggling to, like you said, you went into a room and asked people how many of them wanted to live forever, and just a handful. Then you went into a room of scientists, and there were a lot more. So that speaks to people working on some problems or having an interest or purpose of some sort. Now, if anti-aging worked, and now we have a lot more people living a lot longer with no control and no purpose, or at least limited purpose, and just a handful working on it. The question is, how do you get more people interested without, to work on some problems, and without indulging any philosophy of what purpose is and reason is? How do we get more people?
Interesting. I have a friend who's doing that, Gregory Benford. How many of you know that? He's a first-rate science fiction writer. And unlike most science fiction writers, he's also a very able physicist and had a substantial career in low-energy physics. Namely, when he was a young physicist looking for what to do, somebody said they were throwing out their cyclotron. Cyclotron is this cylindrical machine his is about 12 feet in diameter and weighs quite a few tons. And they said, of course, all the young physicists were to work on high energy things. And this thing only makes a few million electron volts. Nobody's interested in such a small exponent. So he got it and set up a laboratory in Irvine University. But anyway, in the last few years, he started working on selecting Drosophila that live long. And he has some that live about somewhere between 2 and 3 times as long as regular Drosophila. And he knows a lot about what genes are probably involved in that. And has a company which I bet you could invest in if you want. But that's the only one I know of. So the next thing would be to go to mice. And the great thing about, I think the Drosophila is 5 days or something to reproduce, which is some very short time. So that way you can do hundreds of years of experiments every term. Was there? So I wonder how many other people are trying to make longer-lived fleas and then work their way up the evolutionary. Because nobody knows much about aging. The most well-established thing is what do you call the stuff at the end of chromosomes? Telomeres. And every time, at least certain cell families, every time they reproduce, they lose one of those DNA units at the end of the chromosome. And that stops many cancers from growing because if the cancer cells lose their telomeres, then then they can't reproduce for some reason. But of course, some of them find ways to reproduce without that mechanism, whatever it does. And so I bet there are a dozen groups working on aging in the world, but you'd think it would be a lot more, whatever the number is. There's a very small number of people working on cryonics, which is, can you freeze an animal and then revive it at some very long time in the future when medical science has progressed to cure the disease that you would have otherwise died of if you hadn't died of being frozen. And in fact, I know that Benford has subscribed to such a service. So the future might have some good science fiction writers. More disasters. What would happen if people did live 200 years in their present state? Then we would absolutely need robots, because we wouldn't be able to hire enough foreigners to take care of them, because the foreigners would be getting older too. Yes?
Do we need robots if we replace our organs?
Oh, if you can reverse aging or prevent aging, then you don't need anything.
Yeah,
Sure.
probably we're doing that. No, like at least we can produce, I don't know, arms that are robotic arms, and they're like, it's not the same as reverse engineering. I don't know, a lever or something. But
Well, it's a nice question. Do cells wear out, and like a brain cell? Can a brain cell continue to work for 1,000 years, or will it accumulate other non-genetic changes that nobody really knows? Of course, you can grow bacteria for 1,000 years, but what's happening is they're not just aging, they're evolving. And so lots of them do in fact die during this process, and the survivors mutate or develop new genes. And I'm sure if you take E. coli and run it in a bunch of test tubes for 1,000 years, it'll end up quite different. So it's not clear that in some sense, it's not clear that it's immortal. There may be. Every cell has some trace of a few atoms from the original one, but it's not the whole structure. Yeah.
If we just get rejuvenating the cells and the brain function for thousands of years, is it robust enough to do the memory management, hold the baggage of thousands of years, and handle all of that? Do we know? I mean, I would.
No one has the slightest idea. They're pretty sure that memories are encoded in synapses. But as far as I know, neuroscience has a sort of vacuum in between the knowledge about individual cells and the larger structures that remember symbolic things, for example. So they know enough about synapses in very simple animals. Well, what was David's conclusion last time? Do we know the encoding of any particular reflex learned thing in that little worm?
There's basically only two encodings that we completely understand from start to finish in any system, as far as I know. One is the patellotendon reflex, or the knee-jerk reflex, and the other is the gill retraction reflex in aplysia.
What's the MIT professor who mapped out the motor control of the frog leg? Is it Bitsy?
Lettvin?
What?
Lettvin, perhaps?
No, I think Bitsy. What's his name? The frog has a sort of cerebellum-like two-dimensional structure, and they've mapped.
One looks like Alessandro Volta. Oh no.
That was a while ago.
Yeah.
Actually, he's figured out the wiring. No, I'm mistaken. He's figured out the wiring of the motor control of the leg, but it's not learned. The anatomy is clear enough that you can see how, when it wants to turn left, it moves the two legs in the right way. Something like.
And that's about as far as I think anyone's gotten.
So that's the functional wiring, but not with some learning.
Right.
But I suspect what will happen is that it won't be so terribly hard to implant artificial gigabytes of memory in parts of the human brain and get people to learn how to operate it. So,
you can maintain skin cells for 1,000 years, why not neurons?
right. And we'll be able to do that before we know how the human memory works. We'll know all about how the nanotechnology RAMs work, and then maybe you can work backwards from seeing the kind of mistakes you make when you try to correct it. Well, I want a new disaster.
You've got meteors, right?
What's that?
Meteors.
Yes, meteors and volcanoes and those. And there's a nice book by Martin Rees, which is cheerfully called Our Final Hour. Martin Rees is a very good astronomer in England who has the title of Astronomer Royal. So he's discussing mostly physics-type disasters, and I was trying to extend it to, how do you make a religion that sucks everybody in, or a logical argument that makes everyone into a terrorist. That's what the terrorists are looking for. And I suppose there's a remote chance that some philosopher will think of something new one of these days.
Well, if the government makes everyone's life savings disappear, perhaps that's enough.
What will they do?
Get angry, I suppose.
You mustn't tax the rich, because then there won't be any job creators. I love the new kind of logic appears every month with the... Are there any countries with 3 parties?
Oh, yes. There are countries with 3 parties.
Who has 3 parties?
Only?
How does England work?
There's labor, social.
Are there other countries with just 2 parties? Seems crazy to have 2 parties.
Yeah, I think 2 parties is much less common than 3 or more.
2 parties is weird. They're almost always 3 or more or 1.
Say it again. 3
They're
or
almost always 3 or more or 1.
or 1.
Well, Australia's pretty close to 2 parties. It's like 2 1/3 party.
A 3rd party.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
a very tiny.
Just a few people who can be moved.
That's right. In England, my Uncle Harry is famous for the Dogs' Rights Party, of which he and his wife are the only members.
Well, there's this meme that goes around that if you're trying to vote for the 3rd party in the United States, that you're wasting your vote. So
Yes.
that's kind of a destructive idea that keeps it with 2 parties.
Well, they have the same thing in England for a long time, until in the last election, the Liberal Democrats got very big, they became 3rd party, so nowadays England has 3 big parties. But it took 60 years.
Well, I know people who are still mad at Ralph Nader because because the Bush thing came with a very small number of, the Nader votes could have shifted it.
How about something like this for
Nader sent me a book the other day, great big book with about a dozen smart people discussing politics. I haven't opened it.
do you have anything on your list that plays on the good old genetic stuff, such as, for example, you find out that the people who have blue eyes have some genetic thing that makes them inferior in the long run, and so they should be eradicated from the population of the earth in the interests of humankind. And
people
so
who have a what?
Who have blue eyes, for example. And then, of course, they wouldn't be happy with this, and this would create a polarizing effect on the global population as a whole, and they kill off each other. I think this is something that should come out.
Well, how did Hitler get this Aryan thing to be so popular? Anybody understand the psychology of Nazism? Because wasn't there something about being blonde? And not very many Germans are actually blonde. So how did he pull this thing off?
Eugenics and race sciences and things were really popular at that time, not just in Germany. And in particular, a lot of what you see coming out that proves one thing or another are basically misunderstanding correlation with causation.
Good point.
A lot of those studies. I mean, there's also a lot of like purposeful government-backed research and things like that had a specific agenda, especially when you get into Nazi Germany. But that's just from that side. You also have lots of other things like the position Germany was in, and people wanting to scapegoat, and social and cultural ideas.
Yeah.
Not really just the eugenics that were being looked into at that point.
Mm-hmm. So that was just one feature at some particular period of the evolution of the thing.
But there is also
maybe it was at the beginning, when if you could just get all the blonde people, that would give you a start, and then you could broaden it out.
No, if they really look back to the Huns, were supposedly of Nordic descent. The German culture is pretty thick with the Nordic mythology as well, so they feel like there's a connection, even if they're not all blondes.
Just think, we could backbreed them, and if we had with enough correlation, we could make a Hun. It'd be a great project. Yeah.
So people tend to divide themselves into groups and kind of hate the other. Like the sports industry is based on that.
Which industry?
Sports industry.
Oh.
So they're like a team of people that you don't even know and you don't care, and you cheer for them to like beat the other team, and that's kind of irrational. And
sure
like,
is.
there are some studies, I think it's like this, it's called Stanford study, that like they put some students into a prison, and some of them act as the police officers and some as prisoners, and then they tend to divide each other. And so like the prisoners start hating the police, and the police start acting more like violently. And so if you merchandise, like if you say to people, oh, we are as a group better, people tend to believe that and tend to hate another group, and is independent of like how the group's formed. So it's just how we are. We tend to divide into groups. And
hey, could we invent a sport to see if football players are better or worse than basketball players? I would love to invent something that undermines this whole sports thing by getting in real serious argument about which sport is better.
But you might just create like an Uber sport. It might go terribly wrong.
Yeah, I suspect that will backfire.
Yeah.
What was your key word?
Like an Uber sport.
Uber?
Like the sport to conquer all sports.
Yeah.
Did you have that on the
Uber.
list yet?
No, an Uber profession.
It might become the world sport.
Well, just imagine working in an employment agency. There you're not doing, maybe you're inventing jobs and you don't realize that you have an Uber job of some sort. It's the Republican argument that you shouldn't tax people because they're the job creators. It's just such a strange argument because when Patrick and I were running the AI lab, we had a great guy in charge of engineering, and we were arguing about jobs. And he said, if you want jobs, why don't you just get a very long rope and put 1 million people at each end and see who can pull the other across the Mississippi. And because
Football players would win.
Yeah, that's huge. Well, the basketball players go jump.
And I was just turned on the radio this morning, and this casino is going to create 3,000 jobs, it said. And isn't that just like the rope? That is, these people are not actually doing anything except taking money from the poor.
Isn't Wall Street doing that, but with smart people?
Well, yes, and the tragedy is that I've been through this 100 times, but when I was a young professor, all the students became professors. And there seemed to be a point to it all. But around 1980, things started flattening out and American universities stopped expanding. And I think it's partly that the lifespan has extended 1 year every 4. So you don't need new professors very often, and the universities haven't grown. So almost all my first students are professors, and almost all the recent ones aren't. And a lot of them are in Wall Street. So what can we do?
Regulate Wall Street properly.
Maybe you should tax people if their IQ is high and they make more money. A mathematician could work that out. And
Some people will work at getting the highest IQ they could, but not too high that they'd be passed.
not too high, yes.
Or just taking the test to show that IQ.
Doesn't.
I mean, a lot of that boils down to pretty simple economics. You can make, or people can make a lot of money in Wall Street, and the system is set up such that that's fairly doable for a large number of people, and it's really, really hard to get jobs as professors. But if there was more money in research, I imagine you would see a lot more people doing research.
If they made enough
You can argue
money,
whether or
they,
not that's the right reason to.
can they, if you make enough money, can you buy a professorship?
Yeah.
No, but you can start your own lab.
Yeah, that's true. But then you're inclined not to publish if you actually do anything good, then you keep it a secret. Well, how many of you want to be a professor? It's fun. You don't have to do anything. It gives all the more reason to do things.
I also have heard that in the past you had to deal with, I guess, maybe less of the admin and political sort of management you have to do nowadays as a professor. So if somebody simply wanted to, or mainly wanted to be a professor to teach students or to help people, then it might have been a better idea with those assumptions back then.
I missed the first point.
That maybe now being a professor isn't as straightforward as teaching and helping students and sort of the more noble goals of why somebody might want to be a professor. Nowadays, it's also a lot more dealing with politics and dealing with the struggle to get tenure and to look good, and these things that maybe are sort of secondary for people and get in the way of what they actually want to do.
Oh, yeah, that might be true. Because in the golden age, things were expanding. Just that.
So if you did want to just, if your main goal was to teach people, then it might, nowadays, maybe the best way to do that wouldn't necessarily be to be a professor. You could get a job where you could get paid pretty well to do something where you weren't a professor, and then in your spare time you could teach a lot of people. And you could teach people that maybe needed to be taught rather than the ones who were paid to teach.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see what happens if, what's the professor who has the huge web thing going?
What?
Is this guy, this California professor who has got millions of people watching? Sebastian Thrun?
And Peter Norvig.
Oh, but that's very small compared to the new one. What's the guy named Khan?
Oh, he's not a professor, actually.
Actually, how big is the Google thing? The Thrun thing?
It's the Stanford.
Is that pretty big now?
It's several tens.
And they're going to expand.
So that, well, what does that mean? Can they actually get better results than classroom teaching? I don't see why not. But
He's getting like better results in some districts.
Who is?
Ken.
Oh, that's different.
Yeah, Khan Academy actually was never a teacher professor. He began in finance and started out with one video tutorial for his niece that he was tutoring, and just put it up on YouTube for anybody and got positive reviews and started cycling.
well, there's a lot of interesting questions about whether it seems to me that my experience was interesting because if a professor said something that surprised me, I would ask him how he thought, or her. There weren't many hers, I have to admit. I would ask the professor, how did he think of that? And so, because I knew that I could look it up if it was, if it's something, some proof of a theorem, then it's probably published, and very likely Gauss's proof is better than the current one anyway. That's a joke, I think. But I don't see how you could get that out of a non-interactive system. You can't go and ask Andrew Gleason, how did you get that idea? Then he would struggle and maybe tell me how he got that idea, which was... But perhaps a great teacher can evolve lectures in which you not only explain what the student has to know on a test, but you can teach ways to think about it. It's just, I don't know how.
Also, it's how much like cognitive expertise you can convey through a non-interactive lecture.
Exactly, that's the question. And maybe you can do a tremendous amount of it as the thing evolves, because right now, there's nothing the student can type when they're watching the lecture. I presume nobody's, or is there an army of graduate students at terminals answering questions to go with these lectures? What?
These online courses?
Yeah.
Well, what they're learning from, the New York Times is writing up both Khan and Stanford as models. And Stanford took from Khan that you have 10-minute, no more than 5 or 10-minute presentations, and then you have some activity.
Yeah, where did that hour come from?
Yeah.
So in that, but after the 10 minutes, is there an army of people you can interact with?
Well, you interact with the problem, and then you get another 10-minute thing.
Uh-huh.
Now, some places are organizing so they have, like they expect parents, a parent, for example, to be with a high school student or elementary school student, and while they're interacting with this computer stuff.
Yes.
At least in the Khan videos, that people can ask questions underneath each video. And if you look under a video, sometimes you can see a fair amount of decent questions. So in this case, you might not only have your question answered, but you might get other questions that you didn't think to ask. And it's always there to look reference.
Well, in fact, interacting with a person could be that the person, if you didn't seem to understand something, the person gives you similar problems that are just slightly different point of view or slightly easier, or analogies with something that they know you know. And so presuming in the long run you can make these interactive systems have large bodies of pedagogical knowledge for each kind of problem. You could have a huge tree of what are the most common misunderstandings and what's the best hint for getting out of this dead end or that dead end. So maybe something will evolve, but it means there either have to be assistants who can do it, which is unlikely, or natural language understanders that can, so you can reply to this or ask it questions, and it can go find a better lecture for if you're having that particular trouble.
I think traditional classroom, they're lacking things like that as well. Like, I don't think the traditional classroom has done too well.
Well, normally if you have 30 students in a classroom, the teacher is paying attention to 4 or 5 of them, because most people don't interact, and every class, if you're lucky, you have several students who interact.
I kind of feel like with, I kind of feel like since there's so much like just so much that already works just by making these like lectures like a social tool with all like the YouTube videos with like, you know, like it's basically like a frequently asked questions list, like, you know, in the comments. So I feel like I feel like since there's already like an easier than AI like solution to like help with that, there's never going to be like an impetus to actually go and build like a system that will definitely answer your questions, like, you know, answer your questions about the lecture like correctly or give you more practice points. It'd be like such like a harder infrastructure to set up. And I think before that happens, there's just gonna be more tools to make anything easily, like, socially shareable. Like, and like, I think people are going to, like, gravitate more towards making things, making things easier in a social way, because that already seems to be,
Well, that's raising an AI question, because you can imagine some years out that this system evolves and the Stanford thing gets to the point where you can ask a question and, like Siri or this dragon thing here, and you ask it a question and it understands it, and it routes itself to another example of the same thing. And gradually a huge database appears that teaches you a lot of abstract algebra and has thousands of examples and pulls out just the right one for the confusion it diagnoses you to have. So I think, in other words, maybe the AIs will emerge from making interactive teaching programs rather than these sort of artificial projects where you're trying to make a program that actually solves some hard problem. But making a program that has thousands of ways to solve a problem and it didn't invent them might be even better.
So I think one issue here, okay, there are two issues at hand. One issue is...
After all, your calculus teacher didn't invent calculus. That was Newton.
So in speaking about Khan Academy, I think it's important to separate a couple of different issues. So the first issue is like whether Khan Academy is a good tool. And I think in this case, it's clear that like it solves the problems that it does, how do I say this? It's good at what it claims to do. So some advantages that it has is that, well, it explains the concepts clearly, and the video format allows you to like go back and sort of listen to things again if you don't understand it the first time, which you don't quite get in a lecture hall. And the third advantage, as Lily pointed out, is like it sort of acts as a social hub, where different people can like look at each other's questions. Now, just because Khan Academy is good at the things that it claims to do, and maybe some other things too, doesn't mean that like there aren't other tools that like can do more than what Khan Academy does, and can sort of like expand the way that we interact with these learning tools. So I think it's sort of fruitless to say, oh well, Khan Academy is already really good at teaching. That's all we need, because I think, as you said, like there are other tools that are completely like way bigger than the scope of what Khan Academy does that can be really good for education. So for instance, some things that this thing does not address are like, okay, so how does the issue of like interaction between like the professor and the students come into play with learning? Or like, what if you can ask questions that he doesn't cover, and it'll give you a response? So I guess it's the idea of like, okay, so this tool is good for these sets of things, but then there are other features that we might want in a learning tool that it currently doesn't have, and it doesn't even try to have.
So another thing is that a lot of times we'll ask questions to the students. I mean, I don't know, I've seen learning systems where, I think the Stanford one does this, is based on how you answer the questions, it will then gear new questions toward wherever you're weakest. But if you think about a system that might have 40,000 students and you can learn which questions help weak students in certain areas converge towards becoming stronger fastest, then it's like a teacher who's taught 40,000 students, but which takes very few teachers that have that sort of experience or breadth of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
To some extent. There are some economies of scale that you can get only in a computer system that are hard to replicate in the real world.
The system has to get to some level of understanding that we're nowhere near yet, but with things like Siri, apparently you can bluff your way through very well, and maybe well enough that then you can find 4 or 5 answers to the student's question, and the student can quickly see that this particular one is, the student has to be encouraged to be skeptical of the machine. So you ask it a question and it gives you these different answers, and you say, well, it didn't understand me for this and that, okay. Instead of getting upset and trying to convince yourself that it understood you, just say, oh, it's just a dumb machine, but I bet one of these 5 replies is what I really need. Yeah.
I don't know if you ever heard about Quora.
Spell it.
K Q U O R A.
No, I don't.
Quora.
Haven't heard of it.
So basically, they have it's a website where you ask random questions, not random, but they are very specialized questions, and like it's divided. I don't know. Maybe there's AI, neuroscience, and it's very good because there are a lot of smart people there that like the community there.
Oh, it's a social network?
Yeah, kind of a social network. And I don't know, like, for example, for this class, there are some questions that I have in my mind. And sometimes I can just post and really smart people will answer. Like, there are a lot of alumni from MIT and a lot of people from, I don't know, San Francisco, from the Bay Area. And also, there's another resource, I don't know if you've ever heard about it, Edge, where like thinkers, they can post what they are thinking, like smart people, as Brooks.
Your friend, Brockman,
Yes.
right, is Edge.
Yeah. He has quite a good collection of smart people.
And these may be good for like questions that are more research oriented, like, or that Siri can't solve right now.
Mm-hmm. I've been using this Dragon thing because Siri's won't run on my iPhone 4, but Dragon has a question answering thing, and it's unbelievably good. What?
It's the same company, Nuance,
Nuance is running the Siri thing?
owns both Dragon and Siri.
Oh, okay, so maybe it's the same speech engine they stole from Dragon. It's remarkably good, or else I've got the hang of asking the right question. Well, how about one more disaster?
What about wireheading?
Oh,
If it becomes cheap and convenient for everyone to have their own personal paradise, that could quickly lead to the demise of human civilization.
personal what?
Paradise.
Yeah.
Well, there's just turning this pleasure center on without any.
That's wireheading. The opposite of the singularity.
Uh-huh.
Everyone's just on their own, completely disconnected, and everybody's happy.
Well, there are some people get addicted to narcotics in one dose, and lots of people in 5 or 10. But you could imagine a narcotic that addicts you in one dose reliably. That could be pretty dangerous, but. You have to learn to hate pleasure. Yes, how do you get people to like hard problems? All of you wouldn't be here if you didn't really actually like hard problems. Lots of people don't.
If you learn to hate pleasure, wouldn't you learn to hate the pleasure you get from solving hard problems?
If you use the same word for both, but maybe I had a complaint about that in the emotion machine book, which is that that we don't have a lot of words in common use for ways to think. And there are a lot of emotion words, but how many synonyms for pleasure are there for different kinds? I can't think of many.
Like joy, happiness, do those count, or are those too far away?
Yeah, right.
And maybe on the other end.
Passion, no.
Does relief count?
That's a very good point, because a lot of pleasures are when something stops hurting. Anyway, I think, yes, there's a big problem of language for thinking about thinking. And I always think about why Galileo didn't discover the things that Newton did. And I never asked a scholar, but from reading Galileo, I have the impression that he knew that there was energy and momentum, and he thought that and he didn't distinguish them. So there's vis viva, which is the life of motion, or I don't know what it means. But Newton knows that mv squared and mv are very different. And I don't think Galileo got that, and so he got stuck. Because they're both conserved under slightly different conditions. Isn't that terrible? How many of you found that hard? Do you remember when you learned about momentum? I don't.
Do you mean when we learned about it, like in a tacit knowledge sense, or
No,
tacitly?
the word. Is it from some grade school course, or is it college?
Early grade school.
Must be grade school, because I can't remember learning it, so I don't know. I have a grandson who just discovered something for the derivative of acceleration. It's called jerk in some textbooks, but he has a two-dimensional version, and it took him a while to explain it to me. I mean, it took me a while to understand it. So I think our emotion words are not very good, anyway. If a word is old, it's probably not. Yeah.
So you asked how can we increase the amount of people that solve the hardest problems? We need role models that solve hard problems. So for example, professors that are role models for these people and kind of advertise that for people. So an example of that, like in my high school is very science oriented in Brazil, and like most of the people that come here to MIT from Brazil are from my high school, and it's kind of small. And like there are, I think, 2 people that come from Brazil.
What city?
Year. Of this high school.
Yeah.
Etapa.
Where?
In São Paulo.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, like there are students that work with Winston, for example. There's like PhD students now in Harvard that are from this high school. And like the professors, they motivate the students by telling stories about other old people like that went through the same kind of thing that they were going through, and like funny stories, and they motivate by telling the successful stories, and by saying, oh, you could go to MIT, which is a great place, and like there's these funny stories about these people that they become kind of stars.
So can you duplicate that high school, or is it unique?
I think it can be duplicated. Like, you just need some smart person or like some few smart people that can teach, like 3 or 4, that teach like the, for example, physics, mathematics, and chemistry, like science. Math is not a science, but whatever. And you need just some role models and tell these stories. I don't think it's hard. It's about motivating the people, and especially when you're young, you motivate by creating role models. And you say, oh, look at that guy. He doesn't have much money, but he's a superstar. Like and I don't know, that's at least how I came here to MIT was because there was a guy that was really, really smart, 2 years older than me. And like he was famous in the high school because of being here. So.
Well, I think the Chinese has perfected the art. Like in my middle school, or it's a culture that pretty much has like invaded every high school and every household to motivate people to like study really hard, setting up role models, and just like
Are they science oriented?
very science oriented, and not only do they work really hard, try to achieve, they don't, like you said, like they don't have a lot of money, whatever, but they're superstars. Not only do they believe in that, they also believe in it's okay if you try very hard and then fail at the end. That's okay also. So tons of people going to really hard like math and science training and coming out failing because the competition is just so intense. But people still do it anyway, and you know they devote a lot of years and lives into it.
I think that probably the best way to get people to love hard problems is to, like, from childhood, raise them in like communities, in like where all their peers are all into science, because that's like, you know, that's what they're into. I had this experience of like switching between on Long Island, switching between high schools, like switching between junior highs. Like I was at a junior high for like literally 3 miles away from the junior high where I ended up finishing, and like the whole atmosphere of the first junior high was just awful. It was just like these, you know, like no one cool was like into science, and like it was like very, you know, like when you create people where like the norm is like people who are like math science nerds, if you create more of those places where it like, you know, they like self-label that way, you know, people who are like kind of on the edge between like, should I do math and science, or should I just like, you know, make music or something for the rest of my life? Like they'll be more likely to just get swept up in that. I think it's just like a socialized, you need a place to be socialized to be in that.
It's also a question of how much does what you're learning interact with real life. And I went to a high school of science, which was great. But I remember in grade school, Science was really nice, and of course it was pretty hard sometimes. But then there were other things like history, and that was incredibly hard. How come some kids don't find history is completely incomprehensible? It makes no sense, and you can't figure out what will happen next except by looking it up. And how come most of the children don't realize that this is too hard to pay any attention to?
I think they do realize it, but they don't pay attention to it.
Do most people hate history?
I think so.
Oh, good.
Really?
I thought people took it for granted.
And I don't know, like, when I took history, I think what I got out most from that class wasn't the history itself, but rather like how to frame ideas and how to like make a good argument and support it and how to write a good paper, which are like kind of essential life skills.
Right, but even the best argument isn't very good in that field, so it's very tough. Well, I guess if it's hard to find exceptions, then that gets interesting, even if the thing is wrong. I'm not sure what I'm saying, but if a subject has the word science in it, it isn't. Social science and things.
I think with the issue of science, there's no one solution of how to get people motivated in science, right? But there are several different factors. So like one factor is definitely like the idea of having like a social support network, whether it's like teachers who support you, and also having peers who don't make fun of you and ostracize you for liking science and math. That's one. Two, I think there's, the curriculum itself also has something to do with it. As you said, I think it helps more when people can connect it better to the real world, to life. And I think it also helps more when people are sort of allowed a bit of creativity, if you will, like when they're not stuck doing like rote problems all the time. And I think another issue is like sort of presenting problems and solutions and lessons to students in such a way that like they're sufficiently challenged, but they're not discouraged because it's too difficult. And on the other hand, they're not bored because it's too repetitive. So I think it's sort of like a delicate balance, right? All these factors must be there.
Yeah, and that also relates to the hour problem. Like, when can you give someone a problem that might take a whole day or two? And there's no place for that well, there must be. Where in school do you get, that's when you have to write a term paper, maybe.
And I think another thing about science and math, perhaps, at least the grade school incarnations of those subjects, is that they tend to be a lot more isolating than subjects in the humanities. In the sense that like when you're stuck at home doing science and math problems, you're always by yourself and you're always encouraged to, like essentially like quarantine yourself to like study these things and come up with solutions, whereas classes in history or foreign languages or English are more like discussions based. And actually, I think that's sort of, I don't know, because in real life when you solve scientific problems, you are working on a team a lot of the time and you have to communicate your ideas and you kind of like are working together, but somehow like in grade school you're stuck, working on these problems by yourself. And I think that might also be a contributing factor.
Interesting. Well, if you try to solve a geometry problem, have you ever solved a problem working with someone else? Does it help, or are they always interrupting you so you can't concentrate?
In undergrad, for instance, like there'll be office hours or like open office hours where students all come together and kind of like help each other a little or give hints, things like that. And it tends to help for at least, most people, but I guess I'm mostly encountering the other people who go to these things.
I think in grade school, it's too, when the problems that you have to master are too simple. are too, like, that it only requires like one flash of insight to solve the problem. And that flash of insight you're supposed to work towards on your own. Whereas like, if there's like a it's like a problem that takes a day to solve, that takes like 5 flashes of insight, like consecutive flashes of insight to solve it, then like a collaborative.
Okay, here's a problem.
Or you can have
There's an isosceles, these two sides are equal. So that's an isosceles triangle. So now, here are 2 angle bisectors. Okay, so if the triangle is isosceles, prove that the angle bisectors are equal. Has anybody proved it yet? Well, it's very easy. But here's your homework. If you have a triangle and the angle bisectors are equal, prove that the corresponding sides are equal. And see who can get the shortest proof. It's pretty hard.
Have you ever read the essay by Paul Lockhart called A Mathematician's Lament?
What's the third word?
A Mathematician's Lament.
Living?
Lament. Like,
Lament. No, I don't think so.
oh, it's sort of his critique on math education in America. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, I was just thinking that, well, you mentioned that mathematics tends to be pretty slowly, but, well, Marvin brought up that, and I was thinking that for many kinds of mathematical problems, you can prove theorems in different ways, and then, like, somebody comes up with a proof, and then you challenge that, okay, now somebody else find another kind of a proof.
Better
You
proof.
can have a homework of, okay, come up with 4 different ways of proving this thing, and always everything goes. So if you want to work together with people, you can pull up your proofs and so on.
That's why Feynman said he was so great. That is, when he had a physics problem, he forced himself to find several different ways. And he said all of his friends, when they learned quantum mechanics, either learned the Heisenberg matrix method or the Schrödinger differential equation method or the Dirac technique. And whenever he had a problem, he would solve it by all known techniques. And then in later life, he rarely got stuck where most people did. Yeah.
So related to that, the best mathematicians that I know, like, are people that they stay with a problem and they solve by themselves. They don't go and look for the solutions or like ask other people. They try to solve by themselves, and I believe it's just because the way we created pathways. I believe that's
But there are quite a few pairs of mathematicians.
yeah, but like when you're young, you should try to solve the problems by yourself, at least when you're in middle school or high school.
Mhm.
And then you create these pathways.
Right.
Maybe when you get older, the problems are too hard, and then it doesn't help to solve the problem by yourself because you're not going to solve harder problems than those ones. So.
How many of you have ever solved a math problem with someone else? Quite a few. I remember being in a boat with Seymour Papert solving some really hard problem. And after a while, he got tired of it and slipped into the water and went swimming around. And I said, come back. He said, why? And I said, I'll tell you when you get here. And he got back before the shark. Did I ever tell you about? We thought it was a dolphin for a while, but it had this fin on the back that didn't seem quite right. Anyway, I did a lot of solving with, I don't remember ever solving a hard problem with 3 people. That's nice.
Well, you have the simple physics problem of measuring the height of the...
It says low battery. Is that a coincidence? Oh, ringing the bell must have dropped the voltage. The low battery went on about 1 second after I stopped the quack.